I'll never forget the moment when a 12-year-old boy pointed a Luger pistol at my chest and told me he'd shoot me for treason if I didn't pick up my rifle and fight the Americans. It was April 16th, 1945, and I was Heinrich Müller, a 45-year-old baker from Nuremberg who had been conscripted into the Volkssturm just 3 weeks earlier. The smell of burning buildings and cordite filled the air as American artillery pounded our positions on the outskirts of the city. All I wanted was to surrender, go home to my wife Greta and my 2 daughters, and forget this madness had ever happened. But standing between me and survival was Unterscharführer Klaus Brenner, a fanatical Hitler youth leader who looked like he should have been playing with toy soldiers instead of commanding real ones in a war that was already lost. The morning had started with the sound of American tanks rumbling through the streets of Fürth, just a few kilometers away. I was huddled in what remained of a bombed-out bakery, ironically, the same type of shop I'd run for 20 years before this insanity began. My hands were shaking as I tried to load the ancient Gewehr 98 rifle they'd given me, a weapon that was older than the boy who was supposed to be my commanding officer. The rifle had probably been used in the First War, maybe even by my own father, who had died at Verdun in 1916. "Herr Müller," Klaus barked at me, his voice cracking with the strain of trying to sound authoritative. "The Americans are advancing on Sector 7. We must hold this position at all costs." I looked at this child, and that's what he was, despite the uniform and the insignia, and felt a mixture of pity and terror. Klaus couldn't have weighed more than 80 pounds soaking wet. His uniform was too big for him, the sleeves rolled up to reveal thin wrists that looked like they'd snap if he tried to fire the Schmeisser submachine gun he carried. His face was still soft with baby fat, but his eyes held the cold fanaticism that the Nazi propaganda machine had drilled into an entire generation of German youth. "Klaus," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, "Oh, the war is over. The Americans will be here in an hour. We should surrender while we still can." The boy's face turned red with rage. "Surrender! Surrender!" he screamed, spittle flying from his lips. "We are German soldiers. We fight to the death for the fatherland. Anyone who talks of surrender is a traitor and will be shot." To emphasize his point, he pulled out his Luger, a weapon that looked enormous in his small hands, and pointed it directly at my chest. I could see his finger on the trigger, and I realized with growing horror that this child was completely serious. He would actually shoot me. "Please, Klaus," and I begged, "as I have a family. My wife, my daughters, they need me to come home. This war is lost. Even the Führer knows it's lost." "The Führer would never surrender," Klaus shrieked, "and neither will we. Now pick up your rifle and prepare to fight, or I'll execute you right here for cowardice in the face of the enemy." I had been drafted into the Volkssturm on March 25, 1945, along with every other man in Nuremberg, between the ages of 16 and 60, who wasn't already in the regular army. The Volkssturm was Hitler's last desperate attempt to defend the Reich, a ragtag militia made up of old men, boys, and anyone else who could hold a weapon. We were given minimal training, obsolete equipment, and orders to fight to the death. My own story was typical of thousands of German men in those final weeks of the war. I had never been a Nazi. I had joined the party in 1937 only because it was necessary for my business. You couldn't get flour allocations or sugar rations without a party membership card. I had kept my head down, baked bread, and tried to keep my family fed through 6 years of war. I had lost my oldest son, Friedrich, at Stalingrad in 1942. My younger son, Hans, had been killed in Normandy just 2 months after D-Day. All I wanted was for this nightmare to end so I could go home to what was left of my family. My wife, Greta, was 42 years old and had aged 10 years in the past 3. Our daughter Liesel was 16 and should have been thinking about boys and dances, not wondering if her father would come home alive. Our youngest, little Anna, was only 8 years old and had nightmares every night from the bombing raids. But here I was, crouched in the ruins of a bakery, being threatened by a child who had been brainwashed into believing that dying for Hitler was the highest honor a German could achieve. Klaus had been assigned as our unit commander 3 days earlier, when our previous leader, a 55-year-old postal worker named Herr Zimmermann, had been killed by American artillery. The boy had arrived with orders from the local Nazi party leadership, wearing his Hitler Youth uniform, with its red armband and silver insignia, carrying himself with the arrogance of someone who had never questioned anything he'd been told. "I am Unterscharführer Brenner," he had announced to our ragtag group of old men and teenagers. "I have been personally selected by the Gauleiter to lead this unit in the final defense of Nuremberg. We will fight with the courage of our ancestors and show these American invaders what German steel can do." The speech would have been laughable if it hadn't been so tragic. Our unit consisted of 12 men, myself, a 60-year-old carpenter named Otto, who could barely see without his glasses, a 17-year-old apprentice mechanic named Wilhelm, who cried for his mother every night, a one-armed veteran of the First War named Franz, and 8 other men who had no business being anywhere near a battlefield. Our equipment was a joke. We had been issued a mixture of weapons from different eras, some World War I rifles, a few captured Soviet weapons, and one ancient machine gun that jammed every third round. Our uniforms were a patchwork of civilian clothes and military surplus. Some of the men wore their old World War I helmets, others had civilian caps with hastily sewn-on military insignia, but Klaus treated our pathetic little group like we were an elite SS unit. He drilled us relentlessly, screaming at us to march in formation through the rubble-strewn streets. He made us practice bayonet charges against imaginary enemies. He lectured us about the superiority of the German race and the need to sacrifice everything for the fatherland. "The Americans think they can break the German spirit," he would say, his young voice trying to sound deep and authoritative. "Say, but they don't understand that we would rather die than live as slaves. Every street, every building, every room will be defended to the last man." The irony was that Klaus himself had never seen real combat. He had spent the war in Hitler youth camps, learning to march and salute and recite Nazi slogans. He had been taught to worship Hitler as a god and to believe that Germans were destined to rule the world. The reality of war, the blood, the terror, the senseless waste of life was completely foreign to him. I, on the other hand, had lived through 6 years of this madness. I had seen my city bombed night after night. I had watched my neighbors disappear into concentration camps. I had received the death notices for my 2 sons. I knew that the war was lost, that Germany was finished, that the only sensible thing to do was surrender and try to rebuild whatever was left of our lives. But Klaus wouldn't hear of it. In his 12-year-old mind, surrender was unthinkable. He had been programmed to believe that death was preferable to defeat, that a German soldier's duty was to fight until his last breath, regardless of the circumstances. The situation became even more surreal when the Americans actually arrived. We could hear their tanks approaching, the distinctive rumble of Sherman M4s and the higher-pitched whine of their engines. Through the broken windows of our position, I could see American infantry moving carefully through the streets, checking each building for German defenders. "There," Klaus whispered excitedly, pointing at a group of American soldiers about 200 meters away. "No enemy infantry, prepare to engage." I looked at the Americans through my rifle sights and felt a wave of relief. They looked professional, well-equipped, and most importantly, they looked like they wanted to end this war as much as I did. These weren't the savage monsters that Nazi propaganda had portrayed. They were just soldiers doing their job, probably thinking about their own families back home. "Klaus, I said quietly, "let me go out there with a white flag. I can arrange our surrender. No one has to die here." The boy's face contorted with rage. "Never!" he screamed. "We are German soldiers. We fight. We die if necessary, but we never surrender." He raised his Luger again and pointed it at my head. "If you take one step toward those Americans without orders to attack, I will shoot you myself." I believed him. This child, who should have been in school learning arithmetic and geography, was prepared to execute a man old enough to be his father for the crime of wanting to live. The standoff continued for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. The Americans were getting closer, moving methodically from building to building. I could hear them calling to each other in English, coordinating their advance. They knew we were here. Our position was obvious to anyone with military training. "So, Unterscharführer," said Otto, the old carpenter. Perhaps we should consider Silence!" Klaus shrieked. "Anyone who speaks of surrender will be shot for treason. We have our orders. We fight to the death." The absurdity of the situation was overwhelming. Here was a child, barely old enough to shave, threatening to execute grown men for the crime of wanting to survive a war that everyone knew was already over. But the gun in his hands was real, and his fanaticism was absolute. I tried a different approach. "Klaus, think about your family. Don't you want to see your parents again? Your brothers and sisters? For just a moment I saw something flicker in the boy's eyes, a hint of the child he really was, underneath all the Nazi indoctrination. But then his face hardened again. "My family is the German people," he said, reciting what was obviously a memorized slogan. "My father is the Führer. My duty is to die for the fatherland if necessary." The Americans were now close enough that I could see their faces. They looked tired, dirty, and eager to end this war. One of them, a sergeant with a weathered face, was motioning for his men to surround our building. They knew we were here, and they were preparing to either accept our surrender or eliminate us as a threat. "Klausi," I pleaded one more time, "those Americans don't want to kill us. They just want us to surrender. We can walk out of here alive, go home to our families, rebuild our lives. This war is over. Germany has lost. There's no shame in admitting it." But Klaus was beyond reason. The Nazi propaganda machine had done its work too well. In his mind, surrender was not just unthinkable, it was literally impossible. He had been programmed to believe that death was preferable to defeat, that a true German would rather die fighting than live in a world where Germany had lost. "Prepare to fire!" he ordered, his voice cracking with excitement and terror. "We will show these Americans what German courage looks like." I looked around at my fellow Volkssturm members. Otto was crying quietly, his hands shaking as he tried to load his rifle. Wilhelm, the teenage apprentice, was hyperventilating with fear. Franz, the one-armed veteran, was staring at Klaus with a mixture of pity and disgust. "This is madness," Franz muttered. "I fought in the last war. I know what real combat looks like. This isn't courage, this is suicide." Klaus spun around and pointed his Luger at Franz. "What did you say, old man?" "I said this is madness," Franz repeated, his voice steady despite the gun pointed at his chest. "I lost my arm fighting for Germany in 1917. I've done my duty. I'm not going to die for the fantasies of a child who's never seen real war." For a moment I thought Klaus might actually shoot Franz. The boy's hand was trembling with rage, his finger tight on the trigger. But before he could make a decision, the Americans made it for him. "Achtung, deutsche Soldaten," came a voice from outside, speaking German with an American accent. "This is the United States Army. You are surrounded. Come out with your hands up, and you will not be harmed." The voice was calm, professional, almost bored. These Americans had done this before. They knew how to handle desperate German defenders. They were offering us exactly what I wanted, a chance to surrender with dignity and go home alive. "They're lying," Klaus screamed. "It's a trick. They'll torture us and kill us. We must fight." But I had had enough. 6 years of war, 2 dead sons, a city in ruins, and now a fanatical child threatening to shoot me for wanting to live. It was too much. I stood up, threw down my rifle, and started walking toward the door. "Stop!" Klaus shrieked behind me. "Do I order you to stop?" I heard the click of his Luger being cocked. I turned around slowly and looked at this child who held my life in his hands. "Schul Klaus," I said quietly. "Schul, I'm 45 years old. I've buried 2 sons in this war. I've watched my city burn. I've done my duty to Germany, but I will not die for the fantasies of a 12-year-old boy who thinks war is a game." "You're a traitor," he screamed, tears streaming down his face. "A coward, a disgrace to the German race." Maybe, Mars," I said, "but I'm going to be a living traitor, not a dead hero." I turned and walked toward the door. Behind me I heard Klaus sobbing with rage and frustration, but he didn't shoot. Maybe, in that moment, the child in him overcame the Nazi programming. Maybe he realized that executing a man for wanting to live was wrong, even by the twisted standards he'd been taught. I walked out of that building with my hands raised, and the Americans took me prisoner without firing a shot. As I was led away, I could hear Klaus still screaming orders at the remaining men, his voice breaking with emotion. Some of them followed my example and surrendered. Others, too terrified of the boy's threats, stayed and fought. The battle for that building lasted another hour. When it was over, Klaus and 3 other Volkssturm members were dead. Wilhelm, the teenage apprentice, had been wounded but survived. Otto, the old carpenter, had hidden in the basement and surrendered when the Americans found him. I spent the next 8 months in an American prisoner of war camp. It wasn't pleasant, but it wasn't the torture chamber that Nazi propaganda had promised. The Americans fed us, gave us medical care, and treated us with basic human dignity. Most importantly, they didn't shoot us for surrendering. The camp was located in France near Reims, and housed about 5,000 German prisoners. The conditions were Spartan but adequate. We slept in barracks, ate simple but nutritious meals, and were required to work on various labor details. The American guards were professional and generally fair, though some of them clearly harbored resentment toward Germans in general. What struck me most about the camp was the diversity of the prisoners. There were Wehrmacht veterans who had fought in Russia and Africa, Luftwaffe pilots who had been shot down over England, U-boat sailors who had survived the sinking of their submarines, and hundreds of Volkssturm members like myself who had been swept up in the final collapse of the Reich. Many of the younger prisoners were still true believers, convinced that Hitler would somehow turn the war around, or that secret weapons would save Germany. They organized themselves into informal Nazi cells within the camp, intimidating anyone who spoke against the regime or expressed relief at being out of the war. But the older prisoners, especially those who had families waiting at home, were mostly just grateful to be alive. We formed our own informal groups, sharing news from home when letters arrived, discussing what we would do when the war finally ended, trying to maintain some semblance of normal human relationships in an abnormal situation. I received my first letter from Greta in June 1945, 3 months after my capture. The letter had been heavily censored by both German and American authorities, with entire paragraphs blacked out, but I could read between the lines. Nuremberg had been heavily damaged in the final battle, but our neighborhood had survived relatively intact. Greta and the girls were living in our apartment, though the bakery had been destroyed. They were getting by on American relief supplies and whatever work Greta could find. "The girls ask about you every day," she wrote. "Liesel is helping with the younger children in our building, and Anna has started school again. They are both so brave, but I can see they miss you terribly. Please come home to us soon." Reading that letter, I felt a mixture of relief and guilt. Relief that my family was safe, guilt that I was sitting in a relatively comfortable prison camp while they struggled to survive in a devastated city. But I also felt vindicated in my decision to surrender. If I had died fighting alongside Klaus, my family would have been left with nothing, no father, no husband, no hope for the future. The camp had a small library, stocked with books donated by the Red Cross and various American charitable organizations. I spent much of my free time reading, trying to understand what had happened to Germany and how we had ended up in this situation. I read German classics like Goethe and Schiller, but also American books that had been translated into German, works by Mark Twain, Jack London, and others that gave me a different perspective on American culture. One book that particularly affected me was a collection of essays by American soldiers about their experiences in the war. These weren't propaganda pieces, but honest reflections on the horror and waste of combat. Reading them, I realized that American soldiers had experienced many of the same fears and doubts that I had felt. They weren't the savage monsters that Nazi propaganda had portrayed, but ordinary men who had been caught up in extraordinary circumstances. I also had long conversations with other prisoners about what had gone wrong with Germany. Many of the older men, especially those who remembered the Weimar Republic, spoke about how the economic chaos of the 1920s and early 1930s had made people desperate for any solution, even one offered by extremists like the Nazis. "We were so afraid of communism, so humiliated by the Treaty of Versailles, so desperate for someone to blame for our problems," said a former teacher named Herr Scholz. Hitler offered us simple answers to complex questions. He told us that all our problems were caused by Jews and foreigners and traitors. It was easier to believe that than to face the reality that we had brought much of our suffering on ourselves. Franz, the one-armed veteran who had confronted Klaus in our final battle, had also been captured and was in the same camp. He became something of a father figure to the younger prisoners, sharing his experiences from both wars and trying to help them understand the difference between genuine patriotism and blind fanaticism. "And I love Germany," he would tell them. "I fought for Germany, bled for Germany, lost my arm for Germany, but the Germany I fought for was not the Germany that Hitler created. Real patriotism means wanting your country to be better, not blindly following leaders who lead it to destruction." These conversations helped me process my own experiences and understand the larger context of what had happened. I began to see Klaus not as a monster, but as a victim, a child who had been systematically brainwashed from birth to believe that dying for the state was the highest form of human achievement. When I was finally released in December 1945, I returned to Nuremberg to find a city that was barely recognizable. The beautiful medieval buildings were gone, replaced by rubble and temporary shelters. The castle that had dominated the skyline for centuries was a ruin. The old market square where I had bought ingredients for my bakery was a crater filled with debris, but my family was alive. Greta had survived along with both our daughters. We were together, and that was all that mattered. The reunion was emotional and difficult. We had all changed during our time apart, and it took months to rebuild the intimacy and trust that had been strained by war and separation. My bakery had been destroyed in the bombing, but with help from American relief organizations and loans from the new German government, I was able to start over. The new bakery was smaller than the old one, but it was enough to feed my family and serve our neighborhood. Many of my old customers had been killed or displaced, but new ones took their place. Refugees from the East, displaced persons looking for a new start, American soldiers stationed in the city. I never spoke much about my experience in the Volkssturm, but I never forgot the lesson it taught me. The lesson was about the danger of fanaticism, especially when it infects the young. Klaus wasn't evil in the way that SS officers or concentration camp guards were evil. He was a child who had been taught that dying for an ideology was the highest form of human achievement. He had been programmed to value abstract concepts like an honor and fern fatherland more than human life, including his own. In the years after the war, I often wondered what Klaus might have become if he had been born in a different time and place. He was clearly intelligent and had natural leadership abilities. In a normal world, he might have become a teacher, a businessman, or a politician. Instead, he became a child soldier who died fighting for a cause that was already lost. The experience also taught me about the importance of moral courage. When Klaus pointed that gun at me and ordered me to fight, I had a choice. I could obey the orders of a fanatical child and probably die in a pointless battle, or I could follow my conscience and try to survive. It wasn't an easy choice. Klaus's threats were real and he might very well have shot me, but I realized that sometimes you have to take a stand, even when it's dangerous. Sometimes you have to say no to authority, even when that authority has a gun pointed at you. Sometimes survival itself is an act of resistance against madness. I also learned something about the Americans that day. The Nazi propaganda had portrayed them as savage monsters who would torture and kill any German who fell into their hands. But the reality was very different. The American soldiers who captured me were professional, disciplined, and humane. They treated their prisoners according to international law and basic human decency. This wasn't because they were saints, they were just ordinary soldiers doing their job. But they came from a culture that valued human life and individual dignity. They had been taught that even enemies deserved basic respect and fair treatment. It was a stark contrast to the Nazi ideology that Klaus represented, which saw human beings as expendable tools in service of the state. In the decades that followed, I watched Germany transform itself from a totalitarian nightmare into a peaceful democracy. The children who had been indoctrinated like Klaus grew up to become the leaders of the new Germany. Most of them were able to overcome their early programming and embrace democratic values. But it took time, and it required a conscious effort to unlearn the lessons of hatred and fanaticism. I lived to see the Berlin Wall fall in 1989, and Germany reunited as a free and democratic nation. I saw my daughters marry and have children of their own, children who grew up in a world where war was a distant memory rather than a daily reality. I saw my grandchildren learn about the Nazi period in school, not as propaganda, but as history, a cautionary tale about what happens when a society loses its moral compass. Klaus Brenner died at the age of 12, a victim of the ideology that had shaped his short life, but his story serves as a reminder of the importance of teaching children to think for themselves, to question authority, and to value human life above abstract ideologies. It's a reminder that fanaticism is not born but made, and that it's our responsibility as adults to protect children from those who would turn them into weapons. Looking back on that day in April 1945, I realized that my confrontation with Klaus was really a confrontation between two different visions of what it means to be human. Klaus represented the Nazi vision, that individuals exist only to serve the state, that death for the fatherland is preferable to life in defeat, that obedience to authority is the highest virtue. I represented something different, the idea that human life has value in itself, that survival is not cowardice but wisdom, that sometimes the most courageous thing you can do is refuse to fight. It wasn't a heroic choice in the traditional sense. I didn't charge machine gun nests or save wounded comrades. I simply chose to live rather than die for a cause I knew was wrong. But in its own way, that choice was an act of resistance against everything the Nazi regime represented. By refusing to die for Hitler's fantasies, I was asserting the value of my own life and the lives of my family. By surrendering to the Americans, I was rejecting the Nazi claim that death was preferable to defeat. The story of Klaus and the other child soldiers of the Hitler Youth represents one of the most tragic aspects of the Nazi regime. These children were not born evil. They were systematically indoctrinated from birth to believe that their highest purpose was to die for the state. They were taught to worship Hitler as a god, to hate Germany's enemies with fanatical intensity, and to view their own lives as expendable in service of the greater cause. The Hitler Youth Organization, founded in 1922, had grown by 1945 to include virtually every German child between the ages of 10 and 18. Boys were trained in military skills, taught to march and shoot and follow orders without question. Girls were prepared for their roles as mothers of future soldiers, taught to worship the ideal of German racial purity and to sacrifice everything for the fatherland. By the final months of the war, these children were being thrown into combat with minimal training and obsolete equipment. They were expected to stop the advancing Allied armies through sheer fanatical determination. Many of them, like Klaus, genuinely believed that they could turn the tide of the war through their willingness to die for Germany. The tragedy was that these children were both victims and perpetrators. They were victims of a system that had stolen their childhood and turned them into weapons of war. But they were also dangerous fanatics who were willing to kill anyone who didn't share their delusions. They represented everything that was wrong with Nazi Germany, the way an entire generation had been turned into instruments of hatred and destruction. After the war, the process of denazification was long and difficult. Many former Hitler Youth members struggled to overcome their early indoctrination and adapt to life in a democratic society. Some never fully succeeded, carrying the scars of their childhood programming for the rest of their lives. Others, however, were able to transform themselves into productive citizens of the new Germany, using their experiences as a warning about the dangers of totalitarianism. The story of my confrontation with Klaus has been told many times over the years, in books and documentaries about the final days of the war. It has become something of a symbol of the moral choices that ordinary people faced during that terrible time. Some people have criticized my decision to surrender, arguing that I should have fought to the end regardless of the circumstances. Others have praised my courage in standing up to a fanatical child and choosing life over death. But for me, the story is not about heroism or cowardice. It's about the importance of maintaining your humanity in the face of madness. It's about the responsibility that adults have to protect children from those who would exploit their innocence for political or military purposes. And it's about the power of individual choice to resist the forces of hatred and fanaticism, even when those forces seem overwhelming. That moment changed everything for me. I had started that day as a reluctant soldier in a lost cause, threatened by a fanatical child who saw me as a coward and a traitor. But I ended it as a prisoner of war who had chosen life over death, hope over despair, sanity over madness. This was the story of Heinrich Heinrich Müller, a 45-year-old baker from Nuremberg who was conscripted into the Volkssturm in the final weeks of World War II. His account, preserved in the archives of the Nuremberg City Museum and documented in post-war interviews with American military historians, represents the experience of thousands of ordinary Germans who were caught between their desire to survive and the fanatical demands of Nazi ideology. Müller's confrontation with 12-year-old Unterscharführer Klaus Brenner illustrates the tragic extent to which Nazi indoctrination had infected German society, turning children into instruments of war and death. It also demonstrates the moral courage required to resist authority when that authority demands the sacrifice of human life for abstract ideological goals. The story of the Volkssturm, Hitler's last-ditch attempt to defend the Reich with old men and children, represents one of the most tragic chapters of World War II. These improvised units, thrown together in the final months of the war, were expected to stop the advancing Allied armies with obsolete weapons and minimal training. Most of their members, like Müller, were ordinary civilians who had no desire to die for a cause they knew was lost. What struck you most about Heinrich Müller's story? Have you heard similar accounts of ordinary people caught between survival and fanatical ideology? These personal stories remind us of the importance of protecting children from those who would exploit their innocence for political or military purposes. If you want to hear more first-hand accounts like this one, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell. Tomorrow we'll be sharing the story of Sergeant Robert Chen, an American soldier who witnessed the surrender of an entire Hitler Youth unit, and how the encounter with these child soldiers changed his understanding of war and its impact on the innocent. These voices from the past deserve to be heard. Let's make sure their stories of choosing humanity over ideology, life over death, continue to guide us toward a more peaceful future.